Hi, I'm John Perry, and I'm a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians. And today I'm going to talk about part two of Robert's Rules of Order. It's said that approximately 85 to 95% of all organizations, profit and nonprofit, use Robert's Rules of Order. Now, whether we're talking about a homeowners association, a children's baseball league, anything of that nature, it would be costly and time consuming to create all of your own meeting rules. So it's easier to start with Robert's Rules of Order and then create bylaws for those things that you want to do differently than what's in Robert's Rules of Order. Without any further ado, let me get started on this presentation. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. The general Robert's Rules of Order book is very thick and has lots and lots of pages with very small print. This particular book, which is called Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, in brief, will answer most of your questions, 85% or more. It'll be more than what you could ever, generally speaking, would use in meetings. And it's very simple. You can go to a shortcut that I've created at texaselks.org/Roberts, and it will take you to Amazon. It's available in paperback and Kindle versions and costs approximately $7. I cannot recommend this book more highly. Our Grand Lodge Statute 1.130 basically states that if it's not covered in our Constitution, our statute books, which is corporate bylaws or the bylaws of a lodge, then we're going to go ahead and use Robert's Rules of Order. And it's also in Appendix 1, the Voting Requirements Guide, and talks about Robert's Rules of Order there. That's specifically provided in They Shall Prevail. Rules of Governing. Now these are placed with the highest first and the lowest last. And let me kind of explain this. And by the way, you'll see on here where it has page numbers and parentheses, that is from the book I showed you here. So if you get this book, you can follow along, and I'll also talk about a test that you can take. It's a free test, and it's from the National Association of Parliamentarians. And if you get 85, 90% or higher, then you're pretty much going to be the whiz kid on the block. So let's talk about these. Law. Obviously, when you are going to create bylaws or you're going to be using Robert's Rules of Order, you cannot be breaking the law, whether it's federal, state, or local law. And that is the highest priority. You must follow the law. The second thing is a corporate charter, also known as Articles of Incorporation or Certificate of Corporation. And it's a legal document that sets forth a corporation's basic information, such as its location, profit, nonprofit status. Our corporate charter is located in Appendix 5 or Appendix V in our statutes document and goes way back. The bylaws or Constitution. The Constitution is in our statutes annotated book at the very beginning of that book. And statutes are basically corporate bylaws. So from our perspective in Elks, a statute book is basically the corporate bylaws book. And then of course we have bylaws for the lodge. And then we have special rules of order, like limiting the time of debate, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Parliamentary authority, that's actually going into the very thick Robert's Rules of Order newly revised book, because that's the authority for parliamentary procedure. Standing rules, now we're getting to the bottom of the food chain. This might be where initiated members sit. You have a standing rule that says these 10 chairs or whatever are reserved for newly initiated members. And then a custom. Some lodges may, at the end of their lodge meeting, right before closing, sing God Bless America. So those are the rules of governing placed highest to lowest. The thing I want to talk about most first is going to be minutes. And let's take a look at that. Only record what was done, not everything that was said. And I think sometimes in lodge meetings, we're trying to capture everything, and reading of the minutes of the previous session could take 10 or 15 minutes to go through it. And so you want to stay focused on what was actually done, especially under unfinished business and new business. So there is no requirement to take minutes for good of the order or sickness and distress, only the business portion of what was being done. A seconder of a motion need not be recorded. That's in our statutes and also in Robert's Rules of Order. We don't need to document who the second of a motion was. Now, you can if you want to. Notice it says need. It didn't say must not be. It just says it doesn't have to be recorded. The next one is that any time that a mistake is discovered, it can be rectified, even if it's years later. And good minutes are the first line of defense in any organization in lawsuits or retaining, in our case, a nonprofit status. Okay, so let's take a very quick recap of where we are. When our statutes, constitutions, or bylaws of a lodge do not cover a specific issue, that's when we use parliamentary authority as is described in section 1.130 of our statute. Also is in our voting requirements guide, also in statutes appendix 1. So that's our authority to use Robert's Rules of Order newly revised. In the reading of the minutes from the previous session, I've been in meetings where it took 10 to 15 minutes to read the minutes. Minutes are not a verbatim transcription, but rather a brief synopsis of the business conducted. The focus is on business. There is no reason to document in the minutes sickness and distress or good of the order or anything else for that matter if it does not relate to unfinished or new business. This is one way that will greatly speed up your meeting. The minutes should contain what was done, not what was said by the members. And then finally, there's the approval of the minutes. The chair officer or exalted ruler in this case states after the minutes are read, are there any corrections to the minutes? If there are none, then they say, hearing none, the minutes are accepted as read. If there are corrections, we'll get all the corrections off the floor as members offer them, and then finally say if there are no further corrections to the minutes, they stand approved as corrected, and then move on to the next item of business. What is important to note that it does not require a motion or a second or a physical vote to approve the minutes, and this will save you a great deal of time. We're going to talk about the presiding officer. Now, that could be the chair in a membership meeting or veterans committee meeting or something of that nature, or the exalted ruler. But the most important thing about the presiding officer, whoever's running that meeting, is that they are unbiased. You try to facilitate what's going on rather than injecting your own personal opinion. You want to ensure that rules are observed, and that is both from our statutes and your lodge bylaws, and of course, Robert's Rules of Order. I love this definition that I heard once, and it says a presiding officer is like an orchestra conductor. They're trying to mellow the louder voices, at the same time bring forward the softer notes. In other words, we don't want one person to take over a meeting, and then of course the softer notes. We want everyone that's in the lodge room or in any meeting to have a voice. We've already discussed how the presiding officer can approve the minutes without a motion. And then we're going to talk about the last bullet, which is the chair can adjourn without a motion. If you don't have any other business pending, you finish those 3 or 4 items, you can adjourn the meeting. Or it's 8 o'clock, that was the time that the meeting is supposed to end. And regardless of whether you have any business pending or not, the meeting can be adjourned. So if there was one item that was business that you didn't get to, well then next meeting, that is under unfinished business, which comes before the new business. So under these 2 circumstances, the chair can adjourn a meeting without a motion. There are 6 steps in handling a main motion, and it starts out with some member makes a motion, then another member seconds a motion, and then the presiding officer takes and places that motion before the group. Once it is before the group, then the presiding officer is going to open it up for debate. And I have here alternate. In other words, you want to listen to someone who is for it, and then someone who's against it, then someone who is for it, then someone who's against it, until we get a right to speak. Then the motion is put to the vote, and then the presiding officer announces the results. Now, the procedure for handling a main motion is a member rises and addresses the chair, exalted ruler, or if it's in the case of another type of meeting, Mr. or Madam Chairperson. That chair recognizes the member, and then the member states, I move that, and then states the motion that they're bringing. Someone seconds the motion, and they don't need to stand up or be recognized, and says, I second the motion. If the motion is coming from 2 or more members, the motion doesn't need a second. So let's say we're at a membership meeting and 3 of the folks that are on the membership committee say, hey, we've been working on this and we'd like to have a new member dinner next month. Well, if 3 of them brought it up, you don't need a second, because you got one of them that's there, and obviously the other 2 are seconding the motion. Now, what happens if someone doesn't second the motion? Well, if nobody seconds the motion, then that motion dies right there. It doesn't go any further, it doesn't go for a vote. After the motion has been stated and seconded, the chair states it has been moved by the person's name and seconded that, and then reads whatever that motion happens to be. If debatable, every member has a right to debate it. The chair refrains from debating while presiding. So let's take an example of this. There's a motion on the floor in a lodge meeting. The exalted ruler wants to speak. How does the exalted ruler do that? What they would do is give their jewels to someone who does not want to speak, which may be, for example, the next officer in line, the leading knight, loyal knight, lecturing knight, and gives them their jewels while this is on the floor. But the chair refrains from debating while presiding, and better yet, it's best not to debate it unless you really, 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 really have to. Now, the person who proposed the motion, they have the first right to debate. And whatever it is, whatever we're debating, has to be relevant or germane to the motion. So if we're talking about painting the lodge room yellow, you can't be talking about installing new soap dispensers in the bathroom. It must be germane to the topic, to the motion that's at hand. Then the chair says, if there is no further discussion, the motion is, and restates the motion, because there could be some amendments, restates that motion. And then vote. The chair says, all those in favor of the motion, again is stated, show the voting sign of an elk, hands down. Those opposed, same sign. If a motion requires 2/3 vote, a voting sign or ballot would be used, and those are defined in Appendix 1 of our statutes. You should always ask for those who oppose the measure. The result of the vote is stated by the chair. The motion is carried or the motion is lost. If it's a counted vote, then give the number on both sides. Well, let's talk about debate. The chair, in this case, we'll stay with a lodge meeting. The exalted ruler starts it out by asking for discussion. The maker of the motion has a right to speak first if they're properly recognized. So if I made a motion and I don't stand up to be recognized, I'm sitting in my chair, then I'm voiding that. So I have to be recognized. You certainly, as I said, want to alternate between those that are for and against. That way you're not loading it with 2 people against it, and then 7 people for it, and then the vote seems like it's loaded. So you would alternate. You would simply say, now that the maker of the motion has made theirs, you would ask, is there anyone against this motion? If no one stands and says, I'm against the motion, then there's no reason for this to go on debating to say, since there's no one against the motion, I shall call for the question if there's no objection. Can only speak twice on the same question during the same day. Now think about it. I've been in many lodge meetings where somebody wants to speak 3, 4, 5 times. According to Robert's Rules of Order, they can only speak 2 times on the same question. If they stand up and want to speak a 3rd time, you have the right, which we'll talk about later, to stand up and say, point of order. Any motion that stops or limits debate requires a 2/3 vote. And the reason for that is that we might be taking away a person's right to speak, and that's the member's rights. So we can't just arbitrarily say, okay, we're going to talk about the lodge going from smoking to non-smoking, and I've allocated 20 minutes. You don't have the ability to do that. In order to limit that debate, it requires a 2/3 vote of those present in the lodge room. If a vote is tied, it has failed. It did not pass. The presiding officer, chair, the ER, whichever you want to call it, the exalted ruler, does not have to break a tie. So if you had 15 people in the lodge room, including the exalted ruler, and the 14 who were out in the audience, 7 said yay, 7 said nay, and the exalted ruler didn't want it to go through, then the exalted ruler would not vote. But if the exalted ruler did, then yes, they can vote to break the tie and pass the vote. Robert's Rules of Order state that the chair can vote anytime it will affect the outcome. And the reason for that is that whether it's the exalted ruler or chair of a membership committee, they are still a member of our order, are entitled to all the rights that any other member would be given. In the forthcoming videos, we'll talk about more advanced techniques that may come up in a meeting, and also what do you do when you're running a meeting for a committee and it gets unruly or out of order? How do you handle disruptive members? But for today, we're done with part 2, Robert's Rules of Order. Thank you for watching. And of course, we always look forward to your feedback.